We're going to begin with oxygen transport in the blood. When oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it is called oxyhemoglobin, and this is abbreviated with HbO2, where Hb stands for hemoglobin and O2 for oxygen. Oxygen dissolves poorly in water, and so most of the oxygen is going to be transported bound to the hemoglobin. 98.5% of oxygen transport in the blood is bound to the heme of the hemoglobin. Remember, each hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 oxygen molecules. The percent saturation expresses how many of the hemes are occupied with oxygen. In other words, how many oxygen molecules is each hemoglobin carrying? Think of it as 4 quarters in a dollar. Each quarter represents a heme. Oxygen will bind to the heme. If 3 of the hemes have oxygen bound to them, you have a 75% saturation. If all 4 have oxygen bound to them, you have 100% saturation. Affinity refers to the attraction of the oxygen molecule to the heme. In other words, how easily is it for the oxygen to bind to the heme? The higher the affinity, the easier and the quicker the oxygen will bind to the heme. When one oxygen molecule binds to the heme of a hemoglobin molecule, it makes it easier for the second oxygen molecule to bind. This is due to a change in the shape of the hemoglobin molecule. Remember, it's a protein. When the second oxygen molecule binds to the second heme, it changes the shape of the protein even that much more to increase the affinity of the following heme for the oxygen molecule. So the more binding that you have, the higher the affinity for the next oxygen molecule. Hemoglobin that does not have oxygen bound to it is called deoxyhemoglobin or reduced hemoglobin. The abbreviation HB is used to designate deoxyhemoglobin. Since 98.5% of the oxygen being transported in the blood is bound to the hemoglobin, that leaves 1.5% of the oxygen being transported dissolved in the plasma. You will need to know these percentages. Loading of oxygen onto the hemoglobin occurs when oxygen binds to the heme. Unloading is the opposite, when the heme releases the oxygen molecule. Several factors influence the loading and unloading of oxygen to the hemoglobin. The first factor is the partial pressure of oxygen. Remember, the partial pressure of oxygen reflects how many oxygen molecules are present. Let's review. Recall from the previous slide that as an oxygen molecule binds to the hemoglobin, it changes the shape of the hemoglobin to make it easier for the second oxygen molecule to bind. In other words, it increases the affinity of the hemoglobin for the next oxygen molecule. This is going to occur at the lungs. The partial pressure of oxygen is high in the pulmonary capillaries, moving into the pulmonary veins. And since the partial pressure is high for oxygen, that means you have more oxygen molecules available to bind. Each time an oxygen molecule binds to the hemoglobin, the affinity of the hemoglobin for the next oxygen molecule increases. And so you are going to have close to 100% saturation at the lungs of the heme with the oxygen molecules. When you get to the tissues, hemoglobin is going to unload oxygen molecules, and with the unloading of each oxygen molecule, the affinity of the hemoglobin decreases, leading to the unloading of oxygen. A second factor influencing oxygen loading and unloading by the hemoglobin is a chemical called 2,3-BPG, or 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. 2,3-BPG is an intermediate of glycolysis, and is produced by red blood cells when oxygen levels are low. It decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, leading to the unloading of oxygen. A third factor is temperature. When you have an increase in temperature, this is going to decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, leading to unloading. Tissues that are metabolically active are going to produce heat as a byproduct of their chemical reactions. This will increase the temperature in metabolically active tissues. These tissues need oxygen, so it makes sense that unloading of the oxygen occurs here. A fourth factor is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the concentration of hydrogen ions in the fluids. Metabolically active tissues will increase the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the hydrogen ion concentration in the tissue fluid. Both of these are going to decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, which will lead to unloading. Again, this reflects the fact that tissues which are metabolically active require more oxygen. Therefore, it would make sense that hemoglobin unloads the oxygen to make it available for those cells. Factors 2, 3, and 4 then reflect an increase in metabolism and therefore an increased need in oxygen.
The Bohr effect
states that hemoglobin's oxygen binding affinity is inversely related both to acidity, or the hydrogen ion concentration, and to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. If you have an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide or an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration, which is going to drop your pH and make it more acidic, this will decrease the affinity of the hemoglobin for the oxygen, leading to unloading of oxygen, making it available for these metabolically active cells to produce ATP.